In August 2021, a research team in Uppsala, Sweden opened a genome file belonging to a woman from a community of fewer than 1,000 people, and what they found made them stop and check their numbers twice. She belonged to the Ayta Magbukon, an indigenous group living on the forested slopes near Bataan province in the Philippines. Buried inside her DNA was roughly 5% archaic human ancestry, and almost all of it traced back to a mysterious lineage called the Denisovans, a branch of ancient humans so poorly understood that scientists have never found a complete skeleton of one, only a handful of bone fragments and teeth pulled from caves in Siberia and Tibet. 5% does not sound dramatic until you know what it's being compared against. Papuan highlanders in New Guinea, long considered the record holders for Denisovan ancestry at roughly 3 to 4%, were suddenly no longer in first place. Neither were Aboriginal Australians. A small, marginalized community on a single Philippine mountainside was now holding the highest concentration of Denisovan DNA ever measured in a living human being anywhere on the planet, and nobody had seen it coming. Geneticists realized, almost immediately, that their entire model of how the Philippines was populated could not possibly be correct. Something had happened on those islands that no textbook accounted for, and the scramble to figure out what that something was would end up connecting a rhinoceros skeleton, a brand new human species, and a genome map spanning more than 100 ethnic groups into one of the strangest, most rewritten chapters in the story of human migration. For most of the 20th century, the Philippines sat at the edge of the conversation about how people spread across Asia and the Pacific, mentioned in passing but rarely studied with the intensity given to mainland Southeast Asia, Japan, or the islands further east. Part of the reason was pure bad luck with geography. The archipelago's heat and humidity destroy fossils and ancient DNA at a punishing rate, and with more than 7,000 islands and well over 100 distinct indigenous communities, putting together anything resembling a full survey was an undertaking nobody had fully attempted. The accepted story, when people did tell it, was simple. The first humans crossed over from the Southeast Asian mainland tens of thousands of years ago during periods when lower sea levels exposed land bridges between islands. Then around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, Austronesian-speaking farmers sailed south from Taiwan, bringing rice cultivation and pottery, and largely replaced the people who came before them, both genetically and culturally. This is called the out-of-Taiwan model, developed most prominently by the Australian archaeologist Peter Bellwood, and for decades it held up reasonably well. It had linguistic evidence tracing Austronesian languages all the way from Madagascar to Easter Island. It had matching pottery styles across enormous distances. It told a clean, coherent story that was easy to teach in a classroom. It was also, as later evidence would show, dangerously incomplete, and the first crack in it didn't come from a genetics lab at all. It came out of the dirt. In 2018, a team led by archaeologist Thomas Ingeko published a paper in the journal Nature, describing a site in Kalinga province in northern Luzon. Buried there were the bones of a butchered rhinoceros, its skeleton scarred with unmistakable cut marks from stone tools, surrounded by dozens of deliberately shaped stone flakes. The site was dated to roughly 700,000 years old, nearly 500,000 years before our own species, Homo sapiens, had even evolved in Africa. Something was already living on Luzon, hunting large animals and crafting tools, at a time when that island sat surrounded by open ocean on every side. Whatever species this was, it had to have crossed deep water to get there, and how it managed that with no boats as we would understand them remains one of the genuinely unresolved mysteries in Southeast Asian archaeology. Nobody knows for certain which hominin left those marks. The leading candidates are Homo erectus, already known to have reached other islands in the region by that period, or some descendant population that had adapted to island living over an extraordinarily long stretch of time. What the discovery ruled out completely was the idea that the Philippines sat empty and waiting until modern humans finally showed up tens of thousands of years ago. Something with the intelligence and physical capability to hunt and butcher large game had been present on that island for the better part of 1,000,000 years. A second discovery landed a year later in 2019. And it turned out to be even stranger. A team led by paleoanthropologist Florent Detroit, working alongside Filipino researcher Armand Salvador Mijares, published findings in Nature describing fossilized bones and teeth recovered from Calao Cave in northern Luzon. The first fragment, a single-foot bone, had actually been dug up back in 2007 and dated to around 67,000 years old. But by 2019, further excavation had turned up a dozen more fossil pieces, teeth, hand bones, foot bones, and part of a femur, representing at least 3 individuals. What made these fossils genuinely strange was their shape. The teeth were unusually small, and the curvature of the foot bones didn't resemble modern humans at all, looking closer instead to Australopithecus, a genus that had gone extinct in Africa well over 1,000,000 years earlier. This combination of features matched nothing on record. Not Homo sapiens, not Homo erectus, not Denisovans, not Neanderthals. Detroit's team gave it an entirely new name, Homo luzonensis, a brand new human species found nowhere else on Earth, apparently evolved in isolation on a single Philippine island. This placed the Philippines alongside a very short list of places where island isolation appears to have produced its own distinct branch of the human family tree. The most famous comparison is Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit species discovered on the Indonesian island of Flores back in 2003, whose small stature is generally attributed to island dwarfism, a well-documented evolutionary pattern where large-bodied mammals shrink over generations when confined to islands with limited food and space. Whether the same pressure shaped Homo luzonensis is still debated among researchers, but the parallel between two separate island human species emerging in roughly the same region of the world did not go unnoticed. How long Homo luzonensis survived, how its ancestors reached the island, and whether it ever crossed paths with modern humans arriving later. None of that is known because no usable DNA has ever been recovered from the Callao cave fossils. The tropical heat breaks down genetic material within centuries, which means the fossil evidence and the genetic evidence for this particular chapter can never directly speak to one another. So, by the end of 2019, two facts were firmly established that the out-of-Taiwan model had never accounted for. Hominins had occupied the Philippines for at least 700,000 years, and at some point during that span, an entirely unknown human species had evolved there in what appears to have been complete isolation. The islands were clearly not an empty stage waiting for Austronesian farmers to arrive and fill it. Something had been happening there for an extraordinarily long time, and then the genetics arrived, and instead of clarifying the picture, it blew it wide open. The landmark genetics study appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in March 2021. A team led by geneticist Maximilian Loreni at Uppsala University in Sweden, working with Matthias Jakobsson's research group, analyzed more than 2 million genetic markers collected from over 1,000 individuals, spanning well over 100 distinct indigenous Philippine communities. This was not a convenient sample pulled from Manila hospitals. It was, at the time, the most comprehensive genetic survey of the Philippines ever conducted, reaching Negrito hunter-gatherer groups, Cordilleran highland communities, Manobo peoples of Mindanao, Sama seafaring communities of the Sulu archipelago, and dozens of other groups never before sampled at this scale. Assembling a dataset like that took years of fieldwork, built in partnership with the National Commission for Culture and the Arts and local indigenous cultural communities, long before a single sample ever reached a sequencing machine, since earning the trust required to draw blood from communities with a long, uncomfortable history of being studied by outsiders is its own slow undertaking. What the resulting data revealed was that the Philippines had been shaped by at least 5 distinct waves of human migration over roughly the last 50,000 years. Not 2 waves, as the old model claimed. 5. The earliest arrivals were the ancestors of today's Negrito peoples, arriving in 2 separate lineages. A northern group entered Luzon, likely by way of Palawan, while a separate southern lineage, ancestral to communities like the Manobo of Mindanao, entered through the Sulu archipelago. The genetic modeling puts the northern Negrito lineage splitting from a shared ancestor with Australian and Papuan populations around 46,000 years ago, with the southern lineage diverging separately around 37,000 years ago. Both trace back to the same deep Australasian migration, meaning, genetically, these communities sit closer to Papuans and Aboriginal Australians than to any East Asian population alive today. Their ancestors were already established in the Philippines before the cave paintings at Lascaux, before Neanderthals disappeared from Europe, before the last ice sheets pulled back from the northern continents, and their descendants are still there today, in the mountains of Bataan and the forests of the Sierra Madre Range. In communities, the modern Philippine state has often pushed to the margins, but has never managed to erase. After the Negrito migrations, 2 more waves arrived that the out-of-Taiwan model never predicted at all. The ancestors of the Manobo peoples moved into the southern Philippines roughly 15,000 years ago, splitting off from a broader East Asian gene pool right around the end of the last ice age. Not long after, the ancestors of the Sama, the seafaring communities of the Sulu archipelago, arrived by an entirely different route, carrying genetic affinities not with Taiwan but with Austroasiatic-speaking populations from the Southeast Asian mainland, groups related to today's Malabri and other communities in Thailand and Laos. The timing matters enormously, because both migrations predate the Austronesian expansion out of Taiwan by thousands of years, and both carried East Asian ancestry into the Philippines from the south rather than the north. The genetic data places the Manobo and Sama lineages splitting off from the broader East Asian branch around 15,000 years ago, before the ancestral populations of Han Chinese, Dai, Kra Dai speakers, Vietnamese, or even Taiwanese indigenous groups had fully separated from one another. The out-of-Taiwan model described a single defining migration. The genome revealed 5 and 3 of them came from directions the original model never considered at all. These were not organized migrations built around farming or trade networks. As best researchers can reconstruct it, these were small groups of hunter-gatherers and coastal foragers moving along coastlines and between islands by watercraft, adapting to a chain of tropical islands one step at a time, over a period stretching back further than most other studied human migrations outside of Africa. Then came the finding that overturned the cleanest, most confident prediction the out-of-Taiwan model ever made. The Cordillerans are the highland peoples of the Cordillera mountain range in north-central Luzon. Groups like the Bontoc, the Kankanaey, the Ifugao, and the Igorot, famous around the world for the rice terraces carved into their mountainsides. Linguistically, they are Austronesian speakers, and by every conventional expectation, they should represent the clearest living genetic signature of the Taiwanese farming migration that supposedly swept through the region 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. They do carry ancestry consistent with that expansion. But here's where the story flips. The Cordillerans turn out to be the least admixed Austronesian-related population found anywhere on Earth, not just in the Philippines, anywhere. They show less genetic mixing than even the indigenous Yami peoples of Taiwan, the very population the out-of-Taiwan model treated as the migration's original source. The Cordillerans show essentially no detectable gene flow from neighboring Negrito populations, despite thousands of years of close geographic proximity. They lack the northern East Asian ancestry found in every Taiwanese indigenous group tested, and their genetic divergence from Taiwanese populations traces back at least 8,000 years, thousands of years before rice agriculture ever reached the Philippines, which archaeological evidence places at around 2,500 years ago. The implication undoes decades of assumption. The ancestors of the Cordillerans were not farmers when they left the southern China and Taiwan region. They were coastal hunter-gatherers, moving out long before agriculture had even taken hold there, carrying a genetic lineage that would later spread across the Pacific alongside Austronesian languages. The language spread first. Farming technology came afterward, adopted much later along the way. The people themselves moved for reasons that had nothing to do with rice at all. This is a genuine reversal of one of the field's core assumptions. Because for decades, the entire appeal of the out-of-Taiwan model rested on its clean internal logic, that language, agriculture, and ancestry all traveled together as a single bundled package spreading across the Pacific in one coordinated wave. The Cordilleran genome breaks that package apart completely. It shows a population that adopted an Austronesian language, and much later Austronesian farming practices, without ever being replaced by the population usually credited with bringing either one. Their near total absence of mixture with neighboring Negrito groups, despite thousands of years of shared geography, makes the Cordillerans one of the cleanest natural experiments anywhere for studying what a founding Austronesian population actually looked like, before later mixing elsewhere blurred the picture. Now bring the Denisovan thread back into focus, because it connects directly to everything already uncovered. To understand how strange this discovery really is, you have to remember how little is actually known about Denisovans in general. They were only identified as a distinct group of archaic humans in 2010, based on a single fingerbone recovered from Denisova Cave in Siberia, which is where the population gets its name. For years afterward, nearly everything researchers understood about their range came from that one Siberian cave and a single jawbone identified later on the Tibetan plateau. Finding a strong Denisovan genetic signal thousands of miles to the southeast, in a tropical archipelago, was not something the field's existing map of Denisovan geography had prepared anyone for. A companion study by the same research group, published in the journal Current Biology that same year, focused specifically on archaic ancestry across more than 100 Philippine ethnic groups, drawing on roughly 3 million genotyped positions. The finding that the Ayta Magbukon carried the highest Denisovan ancestry ever recorded, translating to roughly 5% of their genome and 30 to 40% higher than the levels found in Papuan highlanders, was striking enough on its own. But the deeper finding in that paper went further still. The Denisovan DNA carried by Philippine Negrito groups appears to come from a separate interbreeding event entirely, distinct from the one that gave Papuan populations their own Denisovan ancestry. The case for that conclusion rested on multiple independent lines of evidence. Negrito populations fell outside the statistical relationship that normally links Denisovan ancestry to Australasian ancestry in Papuan-related groups. Models assuming a single shared Denisovan mixing event were tested directly against the data and statistically rejected. Repeated coalescent simulations, computational models run many thousands of times to test different population histories against observed genetic patterns, consistently showed that only a scenario involving two separate independent Denisovan introgression events, occurring at roughly the same period after Negrito and Papuan ancestors diverged from each other around 53,000 years ago, could reproduce the patterns actually seen in living genomes today. Put plainly, when the ancestors of Philippine Negrito populations arrived in the archipelago, a Denisovan population, or something very closely related to them, was apparently already there, and interbreeding happened locally, on a completely separate path from the encounter that shaped Papuan ancestry further south. Two distinct, archaic populations, two separate encounters, both still detectable today, quietly preserved in the genomes of their living descendants. This finding reshapes what scientists thought they understood about Denisovans as a whole. For years, nearly everything known about this archaic human group came from a small handful of fossil fragments recovered from a single cave in Siberia, supplemented by one jawbone identified on the Tibetan plateau, barely enough physical material to fill a shoebox. Everything else had to be reconstructed indirectly, through the genetic traces Denisovans left behind in the populations who interbred with them. The discovery of a second independent Denisovan encounter in the Philippines means that whatever population the Denisovans actually were, they were not confined to one small pocket of Siberia and Tibet. They were spread in some form across a huge stretch of Asia and the Pacific Rim, encountering different groups of modern humans independently in different places, at different points along the human migration into the region. Some researchers have even pointed to roughly 200,000-year-old stone tools found on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi as possible evidence that Denisovans, or a closely related population, were moving through island Southeast Asia long before modern humans ever arrived. The fossil record for this entire branch of archaic humans remains almost non-existent. The genetic record preserved in the DNA of living people, from Siberia all the way to Bataan, is by far the richer source of information available today. This is where Homo luzonensis becomes very hard to ignore. Its remains are too degraded for any DNA to ever be recovered. But the species was present on Luzon at least 67,000 years ago, overlapping in time and place with the earliest arrival of modern human ancestors in the region. Lorena's research team raised the possibility directly in their paper that Homo luzonensis and the archaic Philippine population responsible for this second Denisovan signal might be related, or conceivably even the same population, showing signs of extreme local adaptation to island life. That remains speculation rather than established fact, but it is the kind of speculation that becomes very difficult to dismiss once genetics and paleoanthropology start pointing toward the same corner of the map from two completely independent directions. There's one more twist buried in the data, and it concerns why the Ayta Magbukon specifically hold the record rather than some other Negrito group. Researchers found that Philippine Negritos later interbred with East Asian migrants who carried very little Denisovan ancestry, and that mixing steadily diluted the archaic signal over thousands of years to different degrees in different communities. The Ayta Magbukon, however, mixed comparatively little with those more recent arrivals, which is why they retained more of their original archaic ancestry than almost anyone else. When researchers mathematically stripped away the effects of that later admixture and looked purely at the original Denisovan signal, the gap widened even further, running as much as 46% higher than what is found in Australians and Papuans. The Ayta Magbukon are not simply a fluke of the data. They are one of the clearest surviving windows into an ancient encounter that most of the rest of the world's population has almost entirely lost. If you are Filipino or carry Filipino ancestry, some version of this layered history is almost certainly sitting in your own genome right now. The exact proportions shift depending on where your family comes from. A Tagalog speaker from Metro Manila carries a different balance than someone from Ilocos in the north or Sulu in the south, but the underlying 5-layer structure is broadly present across the population. A Negrito substrate forms the base. Southern threads come from the Manobo and Sama migrations. Northern Cordilleran ancestry sits on top of that. And whatever more recent admixture your family's particular history layered on afterward completes the picture. It is worth being upfront about the limits of this evidence. The 2021 studies, thorough as they are, rely entirely on modern DNA. Ancient DNA from the Philippine tropics is exceptionally hard to recover, and to date, no ancient genome from a Philippine archaeological site has ever been successfully sequenced. Every estimate of timing and migration direction described here comes from computational modeling based on the genomes of people alive today. And that kind of modeling carries real uncertainty. The divergence dates, 46,000 years, 37,000, 15,000, 8,000, are estimates with margins of error attached, not fixed dates read off a clock. What can be said with real confidence is that the old two-wave model, indigenous Negritos followed by a single wave of Austronesian farmers, was not just slightly incomplete, it was structurally wrong. It missed 3 entire migrations, and it misidentified where the genetic source of the Austronesian expansion actually came from. There's one more thread worth mentioning before this story closes, fainter than the others but genuinely present in the data. Traces of South Asian ancestry turn up among the Sama sea nomad communities, dating to roughly 1,000 years ago, most plausibly connected to Indian Ocean trade networks and the reach of Hindu-Buddhist maritime kingdoms like Srivijaya and Majapahit, which extended their influence across large parts of maritime Southeast Asia during that period. These traces are subtle enough that they only show up under dense, high-resolution genotyping, but they are there, adding one more layer to an already complicated picture. And then there is the colonial period, which surprised researchers for the opposite reason. Despite more than 3 centuries of Spanish rule, the Lorena study found detectable European ancestry in less than 1% of the individuals sampled. Compare that to other regions shaped by European colonization over similar timeframes. Large parts of Latin America, for instance, where European ancestry today often makes up a substantial share, sometimes the majority, of a population's genome. The Philippine case looks nothing like that pattern. Spanish administration was concentrated heavily in urban centers and among a relatively small colonial and mixed heritage elite, while the broader population, spread across thousands of islands in difficult terrain, remained largely outside that direct genetic contact. The result preserved in the data is a population whose deepest genetic layers were laid down tens of thousands of years before any European ship reached the archipelago, with the colonial period sitting on top as a thin, recent addition. The genetic record of the Philippines is not a simple layer cake, stacked neatly in order. It is closer to a document, every contact, every voyage, every generation of intermarriage and isolation written into base pairs that the people who actually lived through it could never have read themselves. It is worth closing where this story began, with the Ayta Magbukon woman whose blood sample set off this entire chain of discovery. She belongs to a community of fewer than 1,000 people living on the forested slopes of a single mountain in Bataan province, a community currently facing real pressure from land encroachment, deforestation, and the slow erosion of traditional ways of life. When her genome was sequenced in a laboratory thousands of miles from home, it turned out to contain more Denisovan ancestry than any other genome in any database on the planet. Somewhere in her cells is the genetic record of an encounter between her direct ancestors and a population of archaic humans who walked through those same Philippine forests, quite possibly 50,000 years ago or more. She does not need a genetics paper to tell her who she is, but the paper does confirm something her community has maintained all along, that they were there first, that their connection to that land predates every other claim laid on top of it, and that the mountains they still call home hold a history that runs deeper than any written archive, any colonial record, any textbook account of how the Philippines came to be populated. For most of the last century, the story of the Philippines was told largely through the lens of who arrived, who conquered, who colonized, and who converted whom, a history measured almost entirely in centuries, built from written records and colonial administrative documents. The genetic record tells a very different kind of story, measured not in centuries but in tens of thousands of years, written not in ink but in the DNA carried inside every living cell of every person descended from the populations involved. It does not replace the written history. It sits underneath it, far older, largely invisible until sequencing technology finally became capable of reading it. 5% Denisovan ancestry, 5 migration waves, at least 2 independent archaic interbreeding events, and roughly 50,000 years of continuous human habitation, all of it converging on a single blood sample taken on a mountainside in Bataan that ended up rewriting a chapter of human history the textbooks are still catching up to.